The dust devil twisted across the main street of Red Bluff, California, and Preston Ramirez doubled over behind the livery stable, his lungs seizing as the gritty air invaded his throat like ground glass. He pressed his bandana against his mouth, but the fabric was so worn it might as well have been a sieve, and he coughed until his ribs ached and his eyes watered, alone in the swirling brown haze that turned the afternoon sun into a dim copper coin. It was March of 1878, and the Sacramento Valley had seen almost no rain for months, leaving the earth parched and vengeful, rising up at the slightest provocation to choke anyone foolish enough to be caught outside when the winds came howling down from the volcanic plateaus. Preston had been working at the livery for nearly 2 years now, ever since he had drifted into Red Bluff with nothing but the clothes on his back and a persistent cough that the trail dust had gifted him somewhere between Nevada and California. He was 24 years old, lean and weathered beyond his years, with dark hair that constantly needed cutting and brown eyes that had seen more hardship than most men twice his age. The livery owner, a gruff German immigrant named Heinrich, paid him fair wages and did not ask too many questions about where Preston had come from, or why he sometimes woke in the night gasping for air, his damaged lungs struggling with some memory of smoke and fire he preferred not to discuss. The dust storm raged for another 10 minutes while Preston huddled against the stable wall, his body racked with coughing fits that left him weak and dizzy. When it finally passed, he wiped the grit from his face with trembling hands and tried to stand, only to find his legs unsteady beneath him. He had dropped the bucket he had been carrying, and water had spilled across the dirt, wasted and precious. Heinrich would not be pleased, but Preston could hardly focus on that through the burning in his chest. "Sweet mercy, are you all right?" The voice was feminine and filled with genuine concern, and Preston looked up to find a young woman standing a few feet away, her green eyes wide with worry. She wore a simple calico dress in shades of blue and cream, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame her face. She carried a basket over one arm, and Preston noticed the logo of the general store stamped on the cloth, covering its contents. "I'm fine," he managed to rasp, though another cough immediately betrayed the lie. The woman stepped closer, setting her basket down on the ground. "You are most certainly not fine. That storm caught you full force, did it not?" Before Preston could protest, another violent coughing fit seized him, and he bent double, his whole body shaking with the force of it. He felt the woman's hand on his shoulder, steadying him, and when he could finally draw a ragged breath, he found her studying him with an expression that was part sympathy and part determination. "How often does this happen?" she asked quietly. "Every time the dust comes up," Preston admitted, seeing no point in lying to someone who had just witnessed him at his worst. "My lungs are not what they should be." "Come with me," the woman said, picking up her basket with one hand and taking his elbow with the other. "My aunt runs the boarding house 2 streets over. You need to get inside and get some clean water in you, and that bandana you are using is about as useful as tissue paper." Preston wanted to argue, wanted to maintain his dignity and independence, but another wave of coughing overtook him, and he found himself leaning on this stranger as she guided him away from the livery. He managed to gasp out, "Heinrich will wonder where I have gone." "Heinrich can spare you for half an hour," the woman said firmly. "I know him well enough. He buys his tobacco from the general store, and I work there 3 days a week. I am Rose Fairweather, by the way, since we seem to be past the point of formal introductions." "Preston Ramirez," he said between coughs, his voice barely more than a whisper. The boarding house was a 2-story structure with whitewashed walls and green shutters, situated on a quieter side street where the dust had not accumulated quite so thickly. Rose led him up the front steps and through a door that opened into a cool, dim entryway that smelled of beeswax and lavender. She called out, "Aunt Miriam, I have brought someone who needs help." An older woman appeared from what Preston assumed was the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She took one look at Preston's dust-covered form and his labored breathing and immediately sprang into action. "Bring him to the sitting room. Rose, fetch clean water and those new bandanas we just received from San Francisco." Preston found himself deposited onto a horsehair sofa while the 2 women bustled around him with an efficiency that suggested they had dealt with dust storm victims before. Rose returned with a pitcher of water and a stack of bandanas that were thick and well made, nothing like the threadbare scrap Preston had been using. She poured him a glass of water and watched to make sure he drank it slowly, her hand hovering near his shoulder as if ready to steady him if another coughing fit struck. Miriam Fairweather was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with Rose's same green eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that Preston immediately respected. She examined him with the practiced eye of someone who had seen plenty of illness and injury in her time running a boarding house in a frontier town. "Your lungs are damaged," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Yes, madam," Preston confirmed. "There was a fire about 3 years back. I got out, but I breathed in a lot of smoke." "And now every dust storm sets you off," Miriam said, nodding. "I have seen it before. Men who worked in the mines mostly, or those who survived building fires. The damage never quite heals right." Rose was folding one of the new bandanas into a triangle, and she stepped closer to Preston with an almost shy expression. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to his face. Preston was not sure what she intended, but he nodded, too exhausted to question. Rose gently tied the bandana around his neck like a loose scarf, then demonstrated how he could pull it up quickly to cover his nose and mouth when the dust came. "This fabric is tightly woven," she explained. "It will not stop everything, but it will be far better than what you were using. And see, you can breathe through it even when it is in place." Her fingers brushed against his jaw as she adjusted the bandana, and Preston felt an unexpected jolt of awareness at the contact. Rose seemed to feel it too, because she drew back quickly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. She cleared her throat and said, "You should keep several of these with you. The dust storms have been terrible this year." "I cannot afford such fine cloth," Preston said honestly. "What I earn goes for room and board and food." "Consider it a loan then," Rose said quickly. "You can pay me back when you are able, or you can return them if you prefer. But I cannot in good conscience let you go back out there with inadequate protection." Miriam was watching the exchange with interest, and Preston caught a knowing glint in her eye that made him suspect she was already drawing conclusions about the connection forming between her niece and this dust-covered stranger. "Rose has always had a generous heart," she said mildly, "sometimes too generous for her own good." "Aunt Miriam," Rose protested, but there was affection in her voice rather than annoyance. Preston stayed at the boarding house for nearly an hour, drinking water and breathing the clean air until his lungs settled, and the coughing subsided to an occasional irritation rather than a constant assault. Rose sat with him for much of that time, asking careful questions about his work at the livery and his life in Red Bluff. He learned that she was 22 years old, that she had come to live with her aunt 5 years earlier after her parents died in a riverboat accident on the Missouri River, and that she worked at the general store to help with household expenses while Miriam ran the boarding house. "It is a good arrangement," Rose said. "Aunt Miriam took me in when I had nowhere else to go, and I try to make myself useful in return. She has taught me everything about running a household, about managing accounts and dealing with the sorts of people who pass through a frontier town." "It sounds like you have built a good life here," Preston observed. Rose smiled, but there was a hint of wistfulness in her expression. "It is a safe life," she said carefully. "A comfortable one, but sometimes I wonder what else might be out there, beyond Red Bluff. I read the newspapers that come in on the stage, and I hear the stories travelers tell, and I think about how big the world is and how little of it I have seen." "The world is not always kind to those who wander," Preston said quietly. "I have done my share of drifting, and I can tell you that safety and comfort are worth more than people realize until they lose them." Rose studied him with those perceptive green eyes. "Is that why you stay in Red Bluff? Because it is safe?" "I stay because my lungs cannot handle much more hard traveling," Preston said honestly, "but also because Heinrich treats me fairly, and because this town has been kinder to me than I had any right to expect. A drifter with a bad cough is not usually anyone's first choice for steady employment." Before Rose could respond, the sound of raised voices drifted in from outside, and both of them turned toward the window. Preston recognized Heinrich's thick German accent even through the glass, and he rose quickly to his feet. "I should get back. He will be wondering what happened to me." Rose stood as well, and for a moment they were very close together in the small sitting room. Preston was acutely aware of how she smelled like lavender and clean cotton, how her eyes reflected the afternoon light coming through the lace curtains. She reached out and adjusted the bandana around his neck one more time, her touch gentle and lingering. Remember to pull it up when the dusk comes, she said softly. And if you need more help, you know where to find me. Thank you, Preston said, and he meant it with a depth of feeling that surprised him. I've been managing these storms alone for a long time. It is strange to have someone care. Everyone needs someone to care, Rose replied. No one should have to face the hard things alone. Preston left the boarding house with 3 new bandanas folded carefully in his pocket and a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the dust or the coughing. He found Heinrich in the livery yard, pacing and muttering in German, but the older man's annoyance melted into relief when he saw Preston approaching. There you are. I thought perhaps the storm had blown you away entirely, or that you were lying somewhere gasping like a fish. I was at the boarding house, Preston explained. Miss Fairweather saw me struggling and brought me there to recover. Heinrich's bushy eyebrows rose toward his hairline. Miss Rose Fairweather? The pretty one with the red hair who works at the general store? I did not particularly notice her hair color, Preston lied, and Heinrich laughed so hard he had to wipe tears from his eyes. Of course you did not, and I am the Queen of England. Well, well, that's interesting news indeed. Miss Rose has been turning down suitors for years, you know. Half the unmarried men in Red Bluff have tried their luck with her, and she has politely but firmly refused every one of them. Preston felt an unexpected flicker of something that might have been jealousy. She seems like a woman who knows her own mind. That she is, Heinrich agreed. Miriam Fairweather raised her well. But come, we have work to do, and that spilled water will not replace itself. Can you manage, or do you need more time? I can manage, Preston said, pulling one of the new bandanas up over his nose and mouth to demonstrate. The thick fabric filtered the air beautifully, and he could breathe far more easily than he had been able to before. Heinrich nodded approvingly and clapped him on the shoulder, and they returned to work. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, but Preston found his thoughts drifting repeatedly to Rose Fairweather and her kind eyes, to the way she had taken charge of the situation without making him feel helpless or pathetic. He had grown accustomed to managing his condition alone, to hiding the worst of his struggles from others, and having someone simply step in and help had been both unsettling and deeply comforting. That evening, after he had finished his duties at the livery and eaten a solitary dinner at the boarding house where he rented a small room, Preston walked through the quiet streets of Red Bluff. The sun was setting behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the air had cooled enough that breathing came easier. He found himself standing outside the general store where Rose worked, though it was long since closed for the night. The windows were dark, but he could imagine her inside during the day, helping customers and managing inventory with the same quiet competence she had shown that afternoon. He was still standing there, lost in thought, when a voice spoke from the shadows. Are you planning to rob the place, or are you just admiring the architecture? Preston spun around to find Rose herself standing a few feet away, an amused smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She carried a shawl over her shoulders against the evening chill, and she looked even prettier in the fading light than she had in the harsh brightness of afternoon. I was just walking, he said, feeling foolish. I did not mean to linger. It is a free country, Rose said lightly. You can linger wherever you like, though I confess I am curious why you chose this particular spot. Preston considered several possible responses and discarded them all as either too revealing or too dishonest. Finally, he settled on, I wanted to thank you properly for what you did today. I was not very coherent earlier, and you left before I could truly express my gratitude. Rose stepped closer, and Preston caught that same lavender scent he had noticed at the boarding house. You already thanked me, she pointed out, but I will not complain if you want to do so again. Thank you, Preston said seriously, for seeing that I needed help and for providing it without making me feel lesser for needing it. That is a rare gift. Something shifted in Rose's expression, a softening around her eyes that made Preston's heart beat faster. You are welcome, she said quietly, and I meant what I said earlier. If you need help again, you need only ask, or even if you do not ask, if I see you struggling, I will likely interfere again. Fair warning. Preston found himself smiling despite his usual reserve. I will consider myself warned, though I hope to avoid another episode like today's. That was worse than usual. The storms have been brutal this year, Rose agreed, Everyone is saying we desperately need rain, but none seems forthcoming. The ranchers are worried about their livestock, and the farmers are watching their crops wither. It feels like the whole valley is holding its breath, waiting for relief that may never come." They fell into step together, walking slowly through the darkening streets without any particular destination. Preston talked more than he usually did, finding it surprisingly easy to open up to Rose about his daily life at the livery, about the horses he cared for, and the travelers who passed through Red Bluff on their way to somewhere else. Rose, in turn, told him stories about her work at the general store, about the colorful characters who came in to buy supplies, and the latest gossip that circulated through the town. "Mrs. Henderson is convinced that the mayor is embezzling town funds," Rose confided with a laugh. "She came in yesterday and spent 20 minutes explaining her theory while I was trying to measure out fabric for her new dress. I think she has been reading too many sensational novels." "Is there any truth to it?" Preston asked, intrigued despite himself. "Not that I can see," Rose said. "The mayor is pompous and somewhat dim, but I do not think he has the cleverness required for successful embezzlement. He can barely balance his own account at the store, let alone orchestrate some elaborate financial scheme." They had reached the boarding house without Preston quite realizing they were heading in that direction, and he felt a stab of disappointment that their walk was ending. Rose seemed to hesitate on the front steps, and then she said impulsively, "Would you like to come for dinner tomorrow evening? Aunt Miriam is making her famous pot roast, and we always have more than enough. She would be pleased to have you." Preston knew he should probably decline, should maintain some professional distance, but he found himself nodding before he could think better of it. "I would like that very much, thank you." Rose's smile was bright enough to rival the last rays of the setting sun. 6 o'clock then. And Preston, bring your appetite. Aunt Miriam's portions are generous." Preston walked back to his own boarding house, a less prestigious establishment on the other side of town, with a lightness in his step that had been absent for longer than he could remember. He lay awake for a long time that night, thinking about green eyes and gentle hands, and the way Rose had tied that bandana around his neck with such care. It had been years since he had allowed himself to feel anything beyond basic survival needs, but something in Rose Fairweather had awakened a part of him he had thought long dead. The next day dragged interminably despite Preston's best efforts to stay busy. He groomed horses until their coats gleamed, he mucked out stalls that barely needed it, he organized the tack room twice, and still the afternoon seemed to stretch on forever. Heinrich noticed his distraction and made several pointed comments about young men who suddenly developed an interest in proper grooming and clean shirts, but he said it with enough fondness that Preston could not take offense. At precisely 6 o'clock, Preston presented himself at the Fairweather boarding house, freshly washed and wearing his best shirt, which admittedly was not saying much. Rose opened the door herself, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, both a little shy now that the casual ease of their previous encounters had been replaced by the formality of a planned dinner. "Come in," Rose said finally, stepping back to let him enter. "Aunt Miriam is putting the finishing touches on dinner, and we have one other guest this evening, Mr. Campbell, who is staying here while he conducts some business with the land office." Mr. Campbell turned out to be a gregarious Scotsman in his 50s, full of stories about his travels throughout California and his plans to purchase land for sheep ranching. He dominated much of the dinner conversation, which Preston found both relieving and frustrating, since it meant he could not talk to Rose as much as he wanted to. But Rose kept catching his eye across the table, small smiles passing between them that felt like secrets shared in silence. The pot roast was everything Rose had promised, tender and flavorful, served with roasted vegetables and fresh bread that Miriam had baked that morning. Preston ate more than he had in months, and Miriam watched with satisfaction, clearly pleased to see her cooking properly appreciated. After the meal, Mr. Campbell excused himself to write letters in his room, leaving Preston, Rose, and Miriam to clear the table and wash the dishes. "Rose tells me you have been having trouble with the dust storms," Miriam said as she handed Preston a plate to dry. "That must make working at the livery quite difficult." "It has its challenges," Preston admitted, "but the bandanas Rose provided have made a significant difference. I was able to work through 2 small dust devils this afternoon without any serious problems." "Good," Miriam said firmly. A man should not have to suffer unnecessarily, not when simple solutions are available. Rose has always been clever about finding practical answers to problems. When she was younger, she invented a better way to stack the firewood so it would dry more evenly and take up less space. I still use her method today. Rose flushed at the praise. Aunt Miriam, you are embarrassing me. I'm stating facts, Miriam corrected. There is no shame in being recognized for one's abilities. When the dishes were finished, Rose suggested that she and Preston take a walk to help settle their dinner, and Miriam waved them off with a knowing smile that made Rose's blush deepen. They stepped out into the evening air, which had cooled considerably now that the sun had set. Rose pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and without thinking, Preston offered her his arm. She took it, and they walked together through streets that were growing familiar to Preston, past shops shuttered for the night and houses glowing with lamplight. Thank you for coming tonight, Rose said after they had walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. I was worried you might decline the invitation. Why would I decline? Preston asked, genuinely curious. Rose hesitated, seeming to choose her words carefully. Because I am rather forward, I suppose. Most women wait for men to do the inviting, but I have never been particularly good at following those rules. I worried I might have made you uncomfortable. You did not make me uncomfortable, Preston assured her. I was pleased to be invited, honored even, though I confess I am still not entirely sure why you took such an interest in helping me. You did not know me, and I was just another dust-covered cowhand in need of assistance. They had reached a small park at the edge of town, little more than a patch of grass and a few benches beneath cottonwood trees, and Rose led them to one of the benches. She sat down, and Preston joined her, acutely aware of how close they were sitting. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, brilliant in the clear desert air, and Rose tilted her head back to look at them before she answered. Do you remember what I said yesterday about how everyone needs someone to care? She asked softly. I meant that. I've watched you around town for months now, Preston. I've seen you working at the livery, always alone, always keeping to yourself. And I have seen you during the dust storms, trying to hide how much you were struggling, because you did not want anyone to see weakness. It made my heart ache, watching you suffer alone like that. Preston felt his throat tighten with an emotion he could not quite name. I have been alone for a long time, he said quietly. After the fire, after I lost everything, it seemed easier to stay that way. Safer, somehow. Safer from what? Rose asked, turning to look at him directly. From disappointment, I suppose, Preston said, the words coming haltingly but honestly. From letting anyone close enough to matter, only to lose them again. Everyone I ever cared about is gone now. My parents died when I was 16. My brother died in the fire that damaged my lungs. I had a girl I was planning to marry, but she could not accept what I had become after the fire, could not bear the constant worry about my health. She married someone else, someone whole and healthy. Rose reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm and firm against his. You are not broken, Preston Ramirez. You have scars, yes, and challenges, but that does not make you less worthy of connection and care and love. The word love hung in the air between them, significant and terrifying. Preston turned his hand in Rose's, so their fingers intertwined, and he marveled at how natural it felt, how right. I'm not sure I know how to do this anymore, he admitted, how to let someone in. We can learn together, Rose said simply. I have kept myself apart too, in my own way. Aunt Miriam mentioned that I have turned down suitors, and it is true, but it was not because I am particularly choosy or proud. It was because none of them saw me, really saw me. They saw a respectable young woman who might make a suitable wife, who could manage a household and bear children and be pleasant company. But they did not see Rose, the person who reads philosophy books borrowed from the minister's library and who dreams of seeing the ocean someday, and who sometimes feels trapped by the very safety and comfort she has built for herself. I see you, Preston said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. I see someone brave enough to approach a stranger in need, someone kind enough to offer help without expecting anything in return, someone honest enough to speak her mind and her heart. I see Rose Fairweather, and I think she is remarkable. Rose's eyes shimmered with tears, but she was smiling as she leaned closer to him. And I see Preston Ramirez. who faces each day with quiet courage despite his struggles, who treats the animals in his care with gentleness and respect, who has not let hardship and loss make him bitter or cruel. I see you, and I think you are worth knowing, worth caring about. They sat together on that bench until the night grew cold and the stars wheeled overhead, talking about everything and nothing, sharing pieces of themselves they had kept hidden for too long. Preston told Rose about his childhood in New Mexico territory, about learning to ride horses before he could properly walk, about the brother who had been his best friend and the fire that had taken him. Rose told Preston about her parents, about the grief that had nearly consumed her in those first months after their deaths, about how Aunt Miriam had saved her with tough love and practical kindness. When they finally walked back to the boarding house, Preston felt as though some fundamental shift had occurred, as though the world had rearranged itself into a new and better configuration. At the front door, Rose turned to face him, still holding his hand. "Will you come again?" she asked. "For dinner or just to visit? I would like to see you again, Preston, often if you are willing." "I'm very willing," Preston said. And then, gathering his courage, he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you, Rose, for everything." Rose's smile was radiant, and she squeezed his hand before reluctantly letting go. "Be safe going home, and remember to use those bandanas if the wind picks up." "I will," Preston promised, and he meant it as more than just a practical assurance. He meant it as a promise to take care of himself, to value his own life and health, because now he had someone who cared, whether he made it home safely or not. The following weeks passed in a blur of work and stolen moments with Rose. Preston found excuses to visit the general store more often than strictly necessary, and Rose began taking her lunch breaks at times that coincidentally aligned with Preston's own break from the livery. They met in the small park, sharing food and conversation, and gradually the town began to notice that the quiet livery worker and the general store clerk were courting. Not everyone approved. Mrs. Henderson, the town gossip, made pointed comments about young women who threw themselves at unsuitable men, and there were whispers about Preston's mysterious past and his damaged health. But Rose held her head high and refused to be swayed by the talk. "Let them gossip," she told Preston one afternoon as they sat together beneath the cottonwood trees. "They have nothing better to do with their time, and I refuse to live my life according to the opinions of bored busybodies." The dust storms continued throughout April and into May, but now when they struck, Rose had a sixth sense for Preston's struggles. She would appear as if summoned, carrying water and clean bandanas, and she would stay with him through the worst of it, her hand on his back as he coughed, her voice steady and reassuring in his ear. "Breathe slowly," she would murmur. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. The storm will pass. I have got you." And Preston, who had endured these episodes alone for so long, discovered that having someone to hold him through the pain made all the difference in the world. The physical discomfort was the same, the burning in his lungs and the exhaustion that followed, but the emotional isolation was gone. He was no longer alone in his suffering, and that simple fact transformed his experience entirely. One particularly bad storm hit in mid-May, a howling monster that swept down from the north and turned the air brown for nearly an hour. Preston had been leading a horse into the stable when it struck, and he barely managed to get the animal secured before the coughing started. This time was worse than usual, the dust so thick he could barely see a foot in front of his face, and panic began to edge into his consciousness as his lungs seized and his vision started to darken at the edges. Then Rose was there, materializing out of the dust like a guardian angel. She had wrapped her own face in cloth, and she carried a large canteen of water and several wet bandanas. She pulled Preston down into a crouch beside the stable wall, wrapping one of the wet bandanas around his face and pressing the canteen into his hands. "Drink," she commanded, her voice muffled but firm. "Small sips. That's it." Preston obeyed, too desperate for air to argue, and gradually the combination of the wet cloth filtering the air and the water soothing his throat allowed him to regain some control over his breathing. Rose wrapped her arms around him, holding him against her as the storm raged around them, and Preston buried his face in her shoulder and simply let her anchor him to the world. When the storm finally passed and the air began to clear, Preston was shaking with exhaustion and residual fear. Rose helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight as she guided him away from the livery and toward the boarding house. Heinrich emerged from the stable office, his own face covered with cloth, and waved them on. "Go, go, take care of him, Miss Rose. The horses can wait." At the boarding house, Miriam took one look at Preston's condition and immediately prepared a steam inhalation with herbs that helped open his airways. Rose sat beside him as he breathed in the soothing vapors, her hand clasped firmly in his, and when he could finally speak without coughing, the first words out of his mouth were, "How did you know? How did you know I needed you?" "I saw the storm building and I knew you would be at the livery," Rose said simply. "I know your schedule now, Preston. I know when you are most likely to be outside and vulnerable. So when the dangerous weather comes, I come to you." "You could be hurt yourself," Preston protested weakly. "That storm was vicious." "Then we will face it together," Rose said firmly. "I told you before that no one should have to face the hard things alone. I meant it, Preston. Whatever comes, we face it together." Looking into her determined green eyes, Preston felt something inside him finally surrender, finally accept what he had been trying to deny for weeks now. He was falling in love with Rose Fairweather, hopelessly and completely, and the thought terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "I do not deserve you," he said hoarsely. "That is not for you to decide," Rose replied, and then she leaned forward and kissed him, gentle and sure, and Preston felt the last of his defenses crumble away to dust. They courted properly after that, with Preston calling on Rose at respectable hours and taking her to church socials and town events. He met her friends and she met his few acquaintances, and gradually they wove their lives together in ways both large and small. Rose taught Preston to dance, laughing as he stumbled through the steps, and Preston taught Rose to ride, steadying her when she grew nervous on horseback. In late June, the rains finally came, breaking the drought in spectacular fashion. The dust storms ceased, replaced by blessed moisture that turned the brown hills green and filled the Sacramento River to brimming. Preston's breathing improved dramatically with the change in weather, and he began to hope, cautiously, that perhaps he might have a future that extended beyond simple survival. One evening in July, as they walked beside the river and watched the sunset paint the water gold, Preston took Rose's hand and said, "I have something I need to tell you." Rose turned to face him, her expression curious but unworried. "What is it?" "I've been saving money," Preston began. "Not much, but steadily, ever since I started working for Heinrich. I've been thinking that perhaps I might eventually purchase my own small property, maybe run a few horses, build something that is mine. But I never had a real reason to pursue that dream beyond vague ambition." "And now?" Rose prompted, a smile beginning to curve her lips. "Now I have a reason," Preston said, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she must be able to hear it. "Now I have you, if you will have me. Rose Fairweather, I love you. I love your courage and your kindness and your practical wisdom. I love the way you wrap my face when the dust comes and hold me through the storms. I love how you see me, truly see me, and do not flinch away from what you find. I know I cannot offer you much right now, just a dusty cowhand with damaged lungs and modest prospects, but I swear to you that I will work every day to build a life worthy of you. Will you marry me?" Rose's eyes filled with tears, but she was laughing even as they spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and sure. "Yes, Preston Ramirez, I will marry you. I will stand beside you through dust storms and difficulties, through good times and challenges, through all of it. I love you too, so much that sometimes I can hardly breathe from the force of it." Preston pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly, deeply, pouring all his love and hope and gratitude into that single perfect moment. Around them the river flowed, and the birds sang their evening songs, and the world carried on. But for Preston and Rose, time seemed to stop, crystallizing into a memory they would carry forever. They were married in September, when the heat had finally broken and the air turned crisp and clear. The ceremony was held at the small church on Main Street, with Miriam tearfully happy in the front pew and Heinrich standing up as Preston's best man. Rose wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she and Miriam had sewn together, with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Preston thought she looked like an angel as she walked down the aisle to meet him. The minister, Reverend Thompson, kept the ceremony short and sweet, focusing on the themes of partnership and mutual support that he knew were central to Preston and Rose's relationship. When he pronounced them husband and wife, the assembled guests burst into applause, and Preston kissed his bride to the sound of cheering that echoed through the small church. They held a modest reception at the boarding house, with food contributed by various townspeople who had grown fond of the couple. Even Mrs. Henderson attended, and she grudgingly admitted that they seemed well suited, though she could not resist adding that she hoped the marriage would be fruitful soon. Rose just smiled serenely and thanked her for coming, refusing to let anything dampen her joy on this day. Heinrich pulled Preston aside during the celebration and pressed an envelope into his hand. "For you and your bride," he said gruffly, "a wedding gift from an old man who has grown fond of you both." Inside the envelope was a substantial sum of money and a note that read, "For the down payment on your property. You have earned this with honest work and good character. Build your dream and be happy." Preston's eyes burned with tears as he shook Heinrich's hand, unable to find adequate words to express his gratitude. Heinrich waved off his attempts at thanks and simply said, "You are a good man, Preston. You deserve good things. Now, go be happy with your beautiful wife." Preston and Rose spent their wedding night at the boarding house in a room that Miriam had prepared with fresh linens and flowers from her garden. They came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies with the same careful attention they had brought to learning each other's hearts and minds. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Rose traced the scars on Preston's chest from the long-ago fire and said, "These are part of your story, part of what made you who you are. I would not change a single thing about you." "Even the damaged lungs?" Preston asked wryly. "Even those," Rose confirmed, "because they brought you to me. If you had not been caught in that dust storm, if I had not seen you struggling, we might never have met properly. So I am grateful for every part of your journey, even the painful parts, because they led you here to me." Preston kissed her forehead and held her close, marveling at how his life had transformed in such a short time. 6 months ago, he had been alone and resigned to a solitary existence defined by survival and caution. Now he had a wife he adored, friends who cared about him, and a future that stretched out bright with possibility. They used Heinrich's generous gift, combined with their own savings, to purchase a small property on the outskirts of Red Bluff. It was not much, just 10 acres with a modest house that needed repairs and a barn that leaned slightly to the left, but it was theirs. They spent the autumn months fixing up the property, working side by side to patch the roof and paint the walls and mend the fences. Preston invested in 3 young horses that he planned to train and sell, putting his years of experience with horses to good use, and Rose started a vegetable garden that she hoped would help them save money on food. The work was hard, and the progress sometimes frustratingly slow, but they were happy in a way that neither had imagined possible. They would collapse into bed each night exhausted and dirt-covered, and Rose would curl into Preston's side and murmur, "We built something good today," and Preston would kiss her hair and agree. The winter was mild by California standards, though they had a few cold snaps that reminded them they were still in the north part of the state. Preston's lungs were much better now that the dust storms had ceased, though he still had occasional bad days when the air was dry or when he overexerted himself. Rose had developed a routine for those times, appearing with her bandanas and her water and her steady presence, talking him through the coughing fits with a calm competence that always amazed him. "You make it bearable," he told her one night after a particularly difficult episode. "When I was alone, these times felt like drowning. Now they just feel like an inconvenience we manage together." "That is what marriage is," Rose replied, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Managing the inconveniences together, celebrating the joys together, building a life that is stronger than either of us could create alone." In the spring, Rose discovered she was pregnant. She told Preston on a warm April evening as they sat on the porch of their little house and watched the sunset paint the hills lavender and gold. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach and said, "We are going to have a baby. In the autumn, I think, around October or November." Preston felt joy surge through him so powerfully that he could not speak for a moment. When he found his voice, it came out rough with emotion. "Are you happy about this? Are you ready?" I'm terrified and thrilled in equal measure, Rose admitted. But mostly I'm happy, Preston. So happy I could burst with it. We are going to be parents. We are going to bring a child into this world and teach them to be brave and kind and true. Is that not the most wonderful, terrifying, amazing thing you can imagine? Preston pulled her into his arms and held her close, his heart so full he thought it might actually burst. It is all of those things, he agreed, and we will do it together, just like everything else. You and me, facing whatever comes, together. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Rose suffered from morning sickness for the first few months and grew increasingly uncomfortable as the summer heat intensified. Preston fussed over her constantly, bringing her water and cool cloths and insisting she rest whenever possible. Rose tolerated his hovering with good humor, though she occasionally had to remind him that she was pregnant, not fragile, and perfectly capable of maintaining some of her normal activities. Miriam was overjoyed at the prospect of becoming a great aunt, and she showered Rose with advice and hand-sewn baby clothes. Heinrich, upon hearing the news, presented Preston with a beautifully crafted cradle he had made himself from oak, with the initials R for Ramirez carved into the headboard. "For the next generation," he said gruffly. "May they grow strong and happy." The baby came in late October, on a cool, clear evening when the stars were brilliant overhead. Rose's labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Preston paced the floor in terror, listening to her cries from the bedroom where Miriam and the midwife attended her. But finally, after nearly 12 hours, a baby's wail pierced the air, strong and healthy, and the midwife emerged to tell Preston he had a son. Preston entered the bedroom on shaking legs to find Rose propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, with a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face and said, "Come meet your son, Preston. Come meet Peter." Preston approached the bed reverently, hardly daring to breathe, and looked down at the small red face of his son. Peter had dark hair like his father and the promise of his mother's green eyes, and his tiny fist was clenched determinedly against his mouth. "He is perfect," Preston whispered, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. "You are perfect, Rose. You are a miracle." "We made him together," Rose said softly. "You and me, we made this beautiful life, and we will raise him together, teaching him all the good things we know about the world." Preston reached out with one finger to stroke Peter's impossibly soft cheek, and his son turned toward the touch instinctively, already seeking comfort and connection. In that moment, Preston understood with perfect clarity what Rose had meant months ago when she said everyone needs someone to care. This tiny person would depend on them for everything, would need their love and protection and guidance, and Preston vowed silently that he would spend the rest of his life making sure his son never felt alone the way he had once felt alone. The early weeks of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Peter was a good baby overall, though he had his fussy periods, particularly in the evening when he seemed to need constant walking and soothing. Preston would pace the floors with his son against his shoulder, singing old Spanish lullabies his own mother had sung to him, and gradually Peter would settle, his small body relaxing into sleep. Rose recovered her strength slowly, and Preston took on extra work around the property to make sure she could rest as much as possible. They fell into rhythms and routines, learning to read Peter's cries and needs, figuring out together how to be parents. Miriam visited often, bringing food and offering to take the baby, so Preston and Rose could rest or spend a few precious hours together alone. "You are doing well," Miriam told them one afternoon as she rocked Peter in her arms. "Being new parents is always hard, but you two are managing beautifully. You support each other, and you both so clearly adore this child. He is lucky to have you." Winter arrived, and Preston found himself grateful that his lungs were so much better than they had been 2 years ago. He needed all his strength and health to keep up with the demands of the property and fatherhood, and having Rose and Peter depending on him gave him motivation to take care of himself in ways he never had when he was alone. One evening in December, after they had put Peter to bed and were sitting together by the fire, Rose said thoughtfully, "Do you remember the day we met? When that dust storm caught you behind the livery?" "I remember," Preston said. "I remember thinking I was going to pass out from coughing, and then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I had not known I was praying. I had noticed you before that day, Rose confessed. I had seen you around town, always working hard, always keeping to yourself. I was curious about you, about the story behind those sad eyes, and then I saw you struggling in that storm, and I just had to help. I could not walk away. I am so glad you did not, Preston said fervently. If you had walked away, if you had decided it was not your concern, I would still be alone. I would have missed all of this, all the beauty and joy you have brought into my life. We saved each other, Rose said simply. I was as trapped in my own way as you were in yours. Going through the motions of a safe, small life, never taking chances, never reaching for more. You gave me a reason to be brave, Preston. You gave me a reason to want more than safety and comfort. Preston leaned over and kissed her, soft and lingering. You wrapped my face and held me through the storms, he said against her lips, literally and figuratively. You saw me at my weakest, and you did not turn away. How could I not love you with everything I am? They sat together in the firelight, comfortable in their silence, listening to the winter wind outside and the small sounds of their baby sleeping in the next room. This was happiness, Preston thought, not the grand dramatic gestures, not the passionate declarations, but these quiet moments of shared contentment, of knowing you are exactly where you belong with exactly the right person. The years that followed were full of both challenges and triumphs. The property prospered as Preston's reputation for training quality horses spread throughout the region. He never became wealthy, but they had enough to live comfortably, to make improvements to the house and barn, to save for the future. Rose managed their finances with the same practical competence she brought to everything, and together they built something stable and lasting. Peter grew into a bright, energetic boy with his mother's curiosity and his father's gentleness with animals. When he was 3, Rose gave birth to a daughter they named Ruth, who had her father's dark coloring and a fierce independence that showed itself early. 2 years after that came another son, whom they named Thomas, sweet-tempered and thoughtful even as a baby. Preston's lungs remained a persistent issue, though never as severe as those early days in Red Bluff. He had learned to manage his condition, to recognize the warning signs and take precautions, and Rose remained his steadfast support through every episode. The children grew up understanding that Papa sometimes needed extra care during certain weather conditions, and they learned from their mother's example how to be patient and helpful without making their father feel diminished. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston and Rose took a rare trip away from the property, leaving the children in Miriam's capable care for 2 nights. They traveled to Sacramento, staying in a real hotel and exploring the growing city, marveling at how much California had changed in the decades since their marriage. But as wonderful as the trip was, they were both eager to return home to their children and their land, to the life they had built together. I never need to see the ocean, Rose told Preston as they rode home in their wagon. I thought I did once. I thought I needed grand adventures and distant horizons, but I found everything I needed right here in Red Bluff, with you and our family. You made me believe I could have a future, Preston replied, taking her hand. When I was alone and struggling through those dust storms, I could not imagine that life held anything beyond mere survival. Then you appeared with your bandanas and your kindness, and suddenly, everything changed. You gave me hope, Rose. You gave me love and family and a reason to keep fighting when things got hard. They raised their children with the values that had sustained them through their own difficulties: courage in the face of adversity, compassion for those who were struggling, the importance of facing challenges together rather than alone. Peter grew up to become a veterinarian, carrying on his father's love for animals in a different form. Ruth, fiery and determined, became a teacher, insisting that education was the key to creating a better world. Thomas took over the property when Preston's health finally forced him to slow down, continuing the horse training business his father had started. Heinrich lived to the impressive age of 87, and Preston was with him at the end, holding the old man's hand and thanking him for the chance he had taken on a dusty drifter with bad lungs. Miriam passed peacefully in her sleep at 82, surrounded by the family she had helped build and sustain. Rose grieved her aunt deeply, but she found comfort in knowing how full and rich Miriam's life had been, how many people she had touched with her strength and generosity. Preston and Rose grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies wearing down but their love remaining constant. Preston's lungs grew weaker with age, and there were times when even the mild California winters left him struggling for breath. But Rose was always there, just as she had been from the beginning, wrapping his face against the cold air, holding him through the difficult moments, reminding him with her presence that he was not alone, and never would be again. On a spring evening when Preston was 73 years old, he and Rose sat together on the porch of the house they had shared for nearly 5 decades. Their grandchildren played in the yard, while their children visited inside, and the air was sweet with the scent of the fruit trees Rose had planted decades ago. Preston's breathing was labored, his lungs finally giving out after years of faithful service despite their damage, and they both knew his time was growing short. "I am not afraid," Preston told Rose, his hand clasped firmly in hers. "How can I be afraid when I have had such a beautiful life, when I have been loved so completely and loved so deeply in return?" Rose's eyes were wet with tears, but her voice was steady. "You gave me everything I needed," she said. "You showed me what it means to be truly seen and valued. Every day with you was a gift." Preston Ramirez. "Rose Fairweather Ramirez," Preston said, using her full name the way he had on their wedding day. "You wrapped my face and held me through every storm, literal and otherwise. You took a broken man and made him whole. You showed me that being vulnerable, being willing to accept help and love, is not weakness, but the greatest courage of all." They sat together as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in glorious shades of orange and pink and gold. Around them their family gathered, sensing that this was a significant moment, and they stood in respectful silence as Preston and Rose held each other close. Preston passed away peacefully just after midnight, with Rose's arms around him and his children's hands on his shoulders. His last breath was quiet, a simple letting go, and Rose held him for a long time afterward, memorizing the weight of him one final time, thanking him silently for every moment they had shared. Rose lived for 5 more years after Preston's death, long enough to see Peter's youngest daughter married, to hold Ruth's first grandchild, to know that Thomas's son was showing the same gift with horses that his grandfather had possessed. She spoke often of Preston, keeping his memory alive for the younger grandchildren who had not known him well, making sure they understood the love story that had started with a dust storm and a moment of compassion. When Rose finally joined Preston, it was on a warm October afternoon, exactly 53 years to the day after their son Peter had been born. She passed, sitting in her favorite chair on the porch, a letter from Ruth's daughter in her lap, a smile on her lips. Her children buried her next to Preston in the Red Bluff cemetery, beneath a cottonwood tree that provided shade and shelter. Their grandchildren gathered after the funeral and told stories about Preston and Rose, about how they had met and fallen in love, about the way they had always supported each other through everything life brought. And the youngest grandchildren listened in wonder, learning about dust storms and damaged lungs in the woman who had appeared like an angel to offer help when it was needed most. The legacy Preston and Rose left was not one of wealth or fame, but something far more valuable. They had shown their family what love looks like in action, what it means to face difficulties together rather than alone, how small acts of compassion can transform lives in ways both profound and lasting. They had taken their own pain and struggles and used them to build something beautiful, something that would endure long after they were gone. The property remained in the family for generations, the house added onto and modernized, but the bones remaining the same. And on particularly dusty days when the wind kicked up and the air grew thick with grit, the descendants of Preston and Rose Ramirez would pull out thick bandanas and wrap them carefully around their faces, remembering the couple who had taught them that no one needs to face the storms alone, that love means being there in the difficult moments, offering shelter and support and the simple but powerful gift of presence. In Red Bluff, California, the story of the dusty cowhand and the woman who helped him became something of a local legend, passed down through the years as an example of how chance encounters can change lives, how choosing compassion over indifference can make all the difference. The dust storms still came, as they always had, and always would in that dry corner of the Sacramento Valley. But the people of Red Bluff faced them a little differently, a little more aware that those who were struggling might need help, that offering a hand or a kind word could be the beginning of something transformative. And somewhere in the vast mystery beyond this life, Preston and Rose walked together still, hand in hand, their love undiminished by death or time. They had found each other in a swirl of dust and difficulty, and they had built a life of meaning and beauty from that unlikely beginning. They had wrapped each other's faces and held each other through every storm, and in doing so, they had discovered the truth that sustains all great love stories, that we are never truly alone if we have the courage to reach out and accept the help that is offered, and that the greatest gift we can give another person is simply to be there, present and steady, through whatever challenges come. Their story ended, as all stories must, but the love they shared continued to ripple outward through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, through the people whose lives they had touched, through the simple example they had set of what it means to love someone completely and be loved completely in return. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy of all, not monuments or fortunes or grand achievements, but the quiet, enduring power of two souls who found each other in the dust and chose, every day for the rest of their lives, to face every storm together.